music of the night. And Jerry, just give me a second here, because I want to have a light up here. Go ahead. You can go ahead. Nighttime sharpens, heightens each sensation. Darkness stirs and wakes imagination. Silently the senses abandon their defenses, helpless to resist the notes I write. For I compose the music of the night. Slowly, gently, night unfurls its splendor. Grasp it, sense it, tremulous and tender. Hearing is believing, music, it's deceiving, hard as lightning, soft as candlelight. Dare you trust the music of the night? Close your eyes, for your eyes will only tell the truth, and the truth isn't what you want to see. In the darkness, it's easy to pretend that the truth is what it ought to be. Softly, deftly, music shall caress you. Hear it, feel it, secretly possess you. Open up your mind, let your fantasies unwind to this darkness that you know you cannot find. The darkness of the music of the night. Close your eyes, start a journey to our strange new world. Leave all thoughts of the world we knew before. Close your eyes and let music set you free. Only then can you belong to me. Floating, falling, sweet intoxication. Touch me, trust me, I'm a physician. Savor each sensation. Let the dream begin. Let your darker side give in to the power of the music that I write. The power of the music of the night. Alone can make this song take flight. So help me make the music of the night. Thank you. Hey, Jerry, when we do the music, just might need a little louder because with me singing, I can't hear the notes. All right? All right, so let's go on and we're going to start talking about what we're doing. Forgot to get to that. So we talked about primary prevention. That's preventing your first heart attack and stroke. And I like the iceberg because when we look at secondary prevention, that is individuals who've already had a heart attack or stroke. And when we think about it, those individuals that we know, that is just the tip of the iceberg. And the number is 10 times, 20 times number of those of us that are at risk for heart attack and stroke. So we want to try to reach out to those individuals as we try to prevent it. Secondary prevention is even the same interventions that we are going to talk about with primary prevention, but there are some modifications to it. We may be more aggressive in certain individuals, and as we age, since that's the biggest risk factor for all of this, there may be times we have to cut back on some of our recommendations because sometimes the complications of our medications or our treatments may actually put individuals at higher risk. An example of this might be somebody as they get older and they're frail and they're not able to walk and their balance is off and they're at risk for falls. We may not want them on blood thinners because even though that might decrease the risk of heart attack or stroke, it might cause them to be more likely to die from a complication of excess bleeding. So, what happens when patients come into my office? Well, many of you may be like this in that you want me to cure your problem. Did we just lose it? Hopefully we won't have that happen too much. But the skin patch band that you saw up there, patients come in, they generally want us to be able to cure them, to treat them with something. You know, whether it is related to the nicotine patch, I can help them and decrease their cravings. What about when we like to eat sweets, or we eat too much salts, too much fat in our food? All of those things, it would be very nice if there was something that I could give to individuals that would make it easier. But what we're going to be talking about is much harder because it's really going to depend on you actually doing many of the things that are interventions. When we talk about heart disease and stroke, I define primary and secondary, but we need to look at the risk factors, and those are the things that we're going to talk about today. So what are those? There are some non-modifiable risk factors. Males are at higher risk than women. As we get older, that's a risk factor we can't change because as we get older, the risk goes up for heart attack and stroke. And once when I was giving a lecture in front of about 500 physicians with a colleague cardiologist of mine, you can get doctors to come for a free breakfast, and that's when the lecture was. The question became, well, what is it that if you had one thing to choose that you would change? And the cardiologist said, my parents. And that's because genetics is a very strong predictor of individuals having heart disease and stroke. But the things that we're going to be talking about would be high blood pressure or hypertension, dyslipidemia, meaning high cholesterol. Obesity is a risk factor. I'm going to talk about metabolic syndrome in a minute. Diabetes, physical inactivity would be a risk factor that's modifiable. The diet that we eat may be modifiable, and whether we're smokers or non-smokers. And more recently, they came out, the only thing that this doesn't include in this graphic would be that metabolic syndrome, which is a combination of many different things. So how did we get to the guidelines? Well, the American Heart Association looked at various specialty agencies that were already giving recommendations, whether it was the National Panel on Cholesterol Treatment, Diabetes Management, and they brought the experts and the recommendations together so that they could come up with one guideline for all these. U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is an agency that looks at the research, our recommendations for screening individuals, for treating individuals with certain things, what type of counseling we give, and it actually looks at Is there a value into doing X because it changes the outcomes for our patients? And then the American College of Cardiologists were involved as well. All right, so those were the agencies that led to the actual recommendations. The next song that we're going to do is with Deb Doyle. It's called An Irish Blessing. Okay. This was originally written years and obviously decades ago, hundreds of years ago actually, and it's called the Irish Blessing, and it ties into a lot of things that the Irish hold dear: the wind, the sun, the rain, and actually the first line, "May the road rise up to meet you," when the song was translated, was actually incorrect. And as they went back and looked at the Gaelic, it actually said, "May you succeed on your journey." So hopefully this is going to be a journey for a healthier heart for you, but this is Irish Blessing. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always with you. May the sun shine warm you always, till we meet again. May the rain fall softly on you. May the hand of God uphold you. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always with you. May the sun shine warm you always, till we meet again. Christ do shield you, Christ be with you. Christ be with you now and always. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always with you. May the sun shine warm you always, till we meet again. Christ in every eye that sees you. Christ in every ear that hears you. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always with you. May the sun shine warm you always, till we meet again. Thank you, Debbie. This one's not. So one of the first steps is really to assess and know what your own risk is. What are the risk factor screening? That's part of the guidelines. And it basically states that every adult should know the level and significance of their risk factors, and it's usually routinely assessed by your primary care physician. At this point, you've not had your heart attack, you've not had your stroke, so there may not be any reasons that you've gone to the cardiologist, so you've got to start somewhere. And then there's a global risk assessment, which is that all adults that are 40 years and older should know their absolute risk for developing heart disease. In 2019, they updated the guideline. It's probably been updated 3 times since I first did this lecture. And most important recommendation and change that they added was that healthy lifestyle changes throughout life are very important. Team-based approaches are very effective and can increase your success. And there's something that we should start to do, and we're doing more often, is determining what are the social determinants of health. If I write a prescription for somebody and they can't afford the medication, it's not going to do them much good, and they're going to come back with their diabetes, let's say, 3 months later, no longer improved. So we have to take into account those as we're thinking about it. Most research is done in the adult population, as we're talking about heart disease, and it usually focuses on the ages of 40 to 75. Not that we don't have people before or after that that we're thinking about, but that's where all their science and the volume of data that they had, that they could actually do some calculations. You want to assess individual with their blood pressure, their cholesterol, and aspirin, and you can use that calculator to determine so that you can get more standardized care from one doctor to the next. Because if the patient's basically the same coming to it, they shouldn't get a different recommendation from each individual provider that they see. We need to consume healthy diet. We need to exercise more. Type 2 diabetes, how to manage it or avoid it. Quitting smoking. Aspirin therapy we'll talk about. We used to use it a lot more frequently than the current guideline has come out with. We'll talk a little bit about high cholesterol treatment as well. So when does it start? It starts at age 20, looking at family history, updating smoking status, alcohol intake, physical activity, and it should be done at every routine wellness visit. Blood pressure, body mass index, waist circumference are important in certain individuals. We'll talk about that. And a pulse every couple years. Your fasting lipids, again, a lot of doctors may order to test every year on individuals, but it actually, if you follow the guidelines, if you've got normal cholesterol levels, testing it every 5 years is adequate. Why? Because 95% of your cholesterol level is actually genetic. So it's not dependent that much on what your diet. You can get a 5% switch by getting a worse diet or a better diet, but in fact, most of it is genetically determined. You'll do it more frequently if you need to. So one of the things out there, and you can always Google this and put your own data, it includes your age, the sex, the blood pressure readings, your cholesterol readings, am I a diabetic, am I a smoker, and it will calculate the risk of you having a heart attack in the next 10 years. And there's even a stroke calculator that you can Google online as well. So let's talk about that first modifiable risk factor. So why is it important to treat high blood pressure? Well, when I was in medical school, there weren't a lot of blood pressure medicines that we could actually write, and most of them made the patient feel worse than they actually did when they didn't have it, when they just had their high blood pressure. Most people are asymptomatic with high blood pressure unless it's really high. And so the risk of high blood pressure doubles your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. So again, that's why it's important over time that we really get that under control. And in medicine, when we're talking about heart disease, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. If you have one risk factor and add a second risk factor, it is not just the additive effects, it is much more than that frequently. All right, and so we can use this and use that 10-year risk assessment. So where do we define blood pressure? Well, we define it as normal being less than 120 and less than 80 on the diastolic blood pressure. And these terms have changed as well. We now call it elevated blood pressure if your systolic is in the 120 to 129 range, but your diastolic is less than 80. We call it now stage 1 hypertension for 130 to 139, blood pressure 80 to 89 for the diastolic. Both these levels combined used to be called pre-hypertension because about 50% of individuals in these groups would actually eventually develop high blood pressure, which is defined as greater than or equal to 140/90. Now, in stage 1 hypertension, we generally are only going to treat that if you've already had your heart attack or you've got significant other diseases like diabetes, chronic kidney disease that are also affecting the same organs. Otherwise, we're going to be treating that with lifestyle modification. When we control it, there's a lot of goals. Most of it is just to get you below that 140/90 number. Lowering your blood pressure, okay, what can you do? Well, dietary, decreasing the salt. There's something called the DASH approach, which is dietary approach to stopping hypertension. You can Google that. It may actually take you directly to the American Heart Association's guidelines. If you download it, don't hit the print button because it's 140 pages long, okay? But there are some summaries in there as well. Aerobic exercise can lower your blood pressure. Weight loss can lower your blood pressure. Medications obviously can do it, limiting the amount of alcohol and supplementing instead of sodium using potassium salts. The other one of the other modifiable risk factors is diabetes. And diabetes, the biggest risk factors you have are family history and obesity. So let's go back 25 years or so to 1995, and this is a map on your left side that plots obesity. And at that particular time, only Alaska had a population where more than 26% of the people living in the state were diagnosed as obese from a medical standpoint. And you can see there were various shades. The darker the orange, the higher the percentage, and it's sort of correlated with the incidence of diabetes. Now look at 2014. Unfortunately, almost every state, we have more than 26% of our population being classified as medically obese. That's a BMI of 30 or higher. And you can see what it's done to our diabetes rates as well. So we see this tremendous increase in obesity, and that's an effect on diabetes. When we're talking about it, and I'm not going to talk about all the individual treatments there are for diabetes now, but some overall facts. First of all, we're striving to get your hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average of your blood sugar, below 7. And that's because when it's above 7, meaning out of control diabetes, what's happening is the blood sugar is damaging the blood vessels and the nerves everywhere in your body. Thus, you're at risk for blindness, heart attack, stroke, kidney failure and going on dialysis, neuropathies where you get numbness or pains in your feet and you can't feel things, so you step on things, get ulcers, and then you get an infection, and that's when amputations occur. So keeping it below 7 is very important because we don't tend to see the damage at that particular point. Diabetes is also considered what we term a coronary equivalent, in that having it by itself puts you at the same risk as if you've already had your first heart attack and stroke. Good control means less complications, as I said, and what's nice is we've gotten more medications with fewer side effects. What we've seen is more individuals are reaching that goal despite the overall prevalence of diabetes going up. The average hemoglobin A1C has come down, our blood pressures have come down, and cholesterol levels have come down as we've been more aggressive in treatment. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, Jerry, this is going to be another Irish song. So I never was quite sure whether Josh Groban's You Raise Me Up was actually an Irish tune. I know that the music that's played at the intro is really that, but in fact it is. It was composed, there was a duet that was a Norwegian and an Irish. The composer was Norwegian. You can start the music, Jer. The individual who wrote the lyrics was the person who was Irish. And the first time it was actually performed, when they put the words and the music together, was actually at the composer's mother's funeral. And so when another song with You Raise Me Up, there's going to be 3 or songs like that today. You know, you think about the words here. On my shoulder, is that a reference to God, our family members, our parents as they supported us? So this is You Raise Me Up. And there's also going to be a second verse, and I like it because there's a reference to the heart that you may not actually have ever heard before. When I am down and oh my soul so weary, When troubles come and my heart burden be, then I am still and wait here in silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. No life without hunger. Each restless heart beats so imperfectly. But when you come and I am filled with wonder, sometimes I think I glimpse eternity. You raise me up so I can stand on mountain. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountain. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I'm on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountain. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up to more than I can be. Thank you. Okay, so when we talk about and tied in diabetes and the risk factors associated with obesity, these are some of the data broken down sort of by age as we go. And when we talk about prevalence, you saw the maps that I had shown earlier, but what are we seeing in our youth population? We're seeing in those 2-year-olds to 19-year-olds over the last almost 20 years, it's gone from 14 to 19%. Adults, males over that same time period have gone from 27% obese to 43% of the population being obese, and women from 33 to 41%. Normal weight, we use something called the body mass index, which is simply a ratio to your height with another bunch of numbers calculated in it, and you'll get this. You can, again, go to any site and type in BMI, and you can take your height and your weight and figure out what yours is. But the lowest risk for heart disease is in this normal weight category, where the BMI is between 18.5 to 25. If you're less than that, it's underweight. Sometimes we worry about anorexia, and there's certain heart disease associated with that, but that's more due to damage to the heart from malnutrition. Overweight is 25 to 29.9, obese is 30 and above, and we use the term severe or morbid obesity when it's over 40, because without any other diseases, that weight class ends up having many other medical problems associated with it. So the optimal goal is to try to get to that, but any weight loss is important. When the BMI is over 25, your provider should at least measure your waist at least once. Men should have a waist that is below 40 inches, women below 35. And that's because when you look at central obesity, that's a higher risk factor, and we're going to talk about that with metabolic syndrome in a little while. As little as a few pounds can improve your risk factors, and your goal is to try to tackle about 10% of that weight during your first year. BMR stands for basal metabolic rate, because I get patients as they get into their 40s and 50s will come in and say, "Doc, I've been gaining weight, but I've been eating the same amount of stuff and I've been exercising the same. How come? What can I do? I must have something else wrong." And unfortunately, we burn calories just while you're sitting here, okay? And that's your basal metabolic rate. What it is, the calories to stay alive, basically, the cells using that energy source. Unfortunately, as we get older, the BMR goes down. So even if we are exercising and eating the same amount, and we're not gaining any weight when we're younger, what happens is we're having a net zero calorie intake to burning every day, but now all of a sudden you're burning fewer calories. So all of a sudden there's excess calories every day, and that starts to accumulate, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So you have to, as we get older, we either got to cut our calories down or increase our calorie burning, otherwise we will lose weight. And so I carry my weight well because I have these convenient love handles. So that goes to tell us about the sort of central obesity is worse. I mean, if you think about somebody like a Marine, okay, shaped like a nice V, all muscle up top, and very thin waist, they could have the exact same weight as somebody who's obese, and it is a strain on them. But again, from a BMI standpoint, the heart is still working harder, but from this bad type of fat or obesity, they're not likely to have that. So we'll go into talking about heart-healthy diet. What is the overall goal? It's to maintain a balance of the calories that you're taking in every day to maintain a sustain or reach that healthy weight. So we've got to eat less, exercise more. The trend over the past 3 decades has obviously been, as you saw with those pictures, the maps, we're seeing weight go up. Exercise has gone down, and a lot of times we get people with the last 2 years of COVID not going to the gym, not going into the office, so instead of walking around the building from meeting to meeting, they're now sitting in front of their computers, and they all come in and say, "Well, I've gained 15 pounds during COVID," and so, again, risk factors. We want to focus on nutrient-dense foods and beverages. What do I mean by that? Try to get as many of the important nutrients in as few of the calories as we can. We eat way too much sodium and too many calories from fats, sugars, and refined grains. This is a great thing, scale showing what we should be emphasizing more of, those fruits and vegetables, the whole grains, plant oils such as soybean or canola, and avoiding the sugars, the processed foods, and alcohol in certain situations, and tropical oils. All in all, we got to take this into account whether we're eating at home or whether we're eating out as well, and we've got to have that heart-healthy exercise we'll talk a little bit about later. So again, when we look at these parallel universes, if you had an identical twin who was there and you only eat 2 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and they're eating 5, and all of the other risk factors are the same, we see a 13% lower total mortality. Now, I never like when they say this because it sounds like you're not going to die if you're eating 5 sets of vegetables and fruits a day. And actually it just means that during the study period, they saw an overall lower mortality, lower cardiovascular risk, lower cancer risk, and a significant lower incidence of respiratory diseases. You want to decrease the consumption of the the trans fatty acids and the saturated fats. We want to pull the nutrient ones, talk about calorie control, and go ahead and talk about the exercise. When you look at specific foods, we should be getting less than 30% of our daily calories from fat. Salt intake. About halfway through, since the 17 years that I've been doing this, we used to say if you were healthy, didn't have high blood pressure or congestive heart failure, you were allowed up to 5 grams of salt a day. But now we're down to recommending 2.3 grams of total salt from your foods that are already in it, or you adding it to it for flavor. And if you're over the age of 51, you should be even getting less than that because of the risk factors it has for heart attacks and for high blood pressure. Decrease those trans fatty acids, and the sugars that we eat should be less than 200 of our calories. But that doesn't mean we can't have foods that we like. And this is just sort of a comparative chart. So if you're eating regular cheddar cheese, you're going to get 114 calories, 6 grams of saturated fat. If you go to Trader Joe's and get their Celtic Light, I picked that out because it's St. Patty's Day. And that's about a 40% reduction in calories just in that 1 ounce of cheese. Likewise with milk. When we talk about whole milk, which is really 3% milk, you get 150 calories versus skim milk for an 8-ounce glass of 100 calories. Now the reason I brought that up is just as a reminder, I mentioned to you about that weight loss and the BMR, what that difference can be. So, a lot of doctors will tell their patients, hey, you need to make sure you're getting enough calcium in your diet. So let's say you had this special Apple Watch app that could exactly measure the calories that you burnt every day and the calories that you ate every day. And at the end of the day, they were neutral. But then you said right before bed, I'm going to have my 8-ounce glass of milk to get my calcium. It's about 100 calories, the 90 there. If you did that every night, 100 calorie difference will add 10 pounds over the course of the year. So it doesn't take much, and that's why when we think about the serving sizes that we have, that's how we're going to need to adapt and change as we get to the right calories that we should be eating. So again, substituting certain meats with certain poultries or with seafood is a good idea. We all love our filet mignon, 420 calories in a 6-ounce piece of filet. Many of the times you go out to the restaurants, it's 8 or 10 ounces, okay, and you get that. But look at what 6 ounces of shrimp would do, 140. That's 33% of the calories that you would get from a filet. We're going to talk a little bit about heart-healthy intake from an alcohol standpoint. Now, these are based on cohort studies, which are studies where you just take groups and ask them questions. It is a scientific method. It's not as good as the double-blinded studies that we do for medications, let's say. And we see this sort of U-shaped or J-shaped curve in that if you have 0 alcohol intake versus high intake, you're at more risk than if you meet the American Heart Association guidelines. But because of the calories associated with it, it's basically stating if you don't drink, don't start drinking to go ahead and get heart healthy, okay? But if you do drink, men are allowed 2 drink equivalents per day, women 1 drink equivalent per day, and you're not allowed to binge drink. So I always, when I ask the question, I always have a follow-up. If the person pauses when I ask them, how much do you drink every day? And they say, well, I average 2 drinks a day. They don't drink Monday through Friday, but they have 2 6-packs on Saturday. That's averaging less than 2 drinks a day, okay? So you got to be careful. And what is a drink equivalent? Well, it's equal to 1 ounce of 100% alcohol, which we don't usually drink. But that would equal a shot or 1.5 ounces of a hard liquor, 4 ounces of wine, or 1 beer. So those would be a drink equivalent. Men would be able to have 2 of those. Women would be able to have 1. All right. So we're going to liven it up a little bit here. And so Mark Miley is going to play a song called Believe Me. Okay, so when we talk about weight loss, you saw that that was that scale on that graphic as well. And this kind of equates to to lose 1 pound, you have to burn 3,500 calories, okay? So that means that over time, you're going to be burning that. You're going to have to get into that negative calorie. And again, that equates to that 10 pounds a year if you're doing 100 extra calories every day that you would gain. Or likewise, if you find a simple way to knock out 100 calories every day, you'll be 10 pounds lighter at the end of a year without doing anything else. When we diet alone, we lose about 70% of our weight happens to be fat that we lose versus 25% of it being our lean muscle mass. If you diet with exercise, you can see, you lose a lot more fat than you do muscle. And the nice thing about muscle is it does burn calories a lot more calories per minute than fat does. When you do lose weight, you don't lose fat cells in generally unless you're doing liposuction or lasers that melt fat. Generally, you're just decreasing the size of the fat cells. As little as 5% body weight decrease does decrease the risk for coronary artery disease. Types of weight management, well, you've heard of hundreds of different types of diets. In general, when you correct for the calorie intake of the individual and or the exercise that was in the study, it really doesn't matter for most individuals. Now, some people tolerate one type of diet better than the other, so they're more likely to stick with it. But when we think about the calories, that is the most important part of the diet that you're looking at, not what type of diet, high protein, keto, etc. Medical assistance, there's medications that we can use or surgery. There's exercise that helps with it. When we talk about the surgical procedures, we're talking about individuals who have that bone mass over 40. And when you look at all of the long-term studies, bariatric surgery is the most successful for long-term weight reduction and actually can reverse individuals who were not only obese and diabetic, but they can get their weight down and become non-diabetic at that point. We can do bariatric surgery for BMIs 35 or higher if individuals have additional risk factors. Exercise, okay, typical physical activity, if you're just doing regular stuff, will be 8 to 9 pounds loss with 1 year later. And if you add it with some behavioral training, you can also get a couple more pounds. By itself, exercise is not necessarily the best way to lose weight, but it is a great way to prevent weight regain and decrease other cardiovascular risks as well. When we look at that modifiable risk factor of cholesterol, remember I said most of it is genetic, which is why the cardiologist wanted to change his parents if he was going to lower his risk factor. Ideally, we used to use, and how we treat cholesterol has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Not necessarily the medications, but how we monitor it, what are we targeting. We used to try to measure, oh, your bad cholesterol is here, we want to make sure we keep putting you on more medicine until you get to here. Now it's pretty much determine their risk, determine whether or not they're going to go on a moderate intensity versus a high intensity statin. We use that 10-year cardiovascular risk assessment. Low risk is less than 5% chance of having a heart attack in the next 10 years. Borderline risk is in that 5 to 7.5%. And most agencies talk, including the American Heart Association, that if you're 7.5% or higher with your risk factor calculation, then you are basically at a high enough risk that statin therapy would generally benefit you. Okay, and it will actually benefit everybody, but that's where you start to see the separation between what you would have had as your risk of having a heart attack every 10 years versus you having a lower cholesterol. Sometimes when you're in the borderline and there are other factors, we may use some other tests like your C-reactive protein or coronary artery calcium scanning, but those are generally not needed that many times. With secondary prevention, as we get older and more people have had their heart attack or stroke, what we look at is if you're less than 75, you're going to be able to tolerate, and we recommend starting with the highest statin dose to get you down as low as possible. If you're already over 75, you can start either with the moderate or in high intensity. And if you've already been on it for other reasons and have been tolerating a high intensity statin therapy, then continue on it as you get older. Yes, there's a pill that will control your cholesterol, but it may raise your blood pressure. So again, remember what I said about compliance. We need to make sure that side effects, that people are taking their medication, because there are things that we can do to change it. When we talk about cholesterol, diet, obesity, exercise, you can see here's a little chart. Many things will improve our LDL or low density lipoprotein. We want the low to be as low as possible because it's the bad or lousy cholesterol. We want the HDL, high density lipoprotein, to be as high as possible because it's the good cholesterol. Moderate alcohol intake, Mediterranean diet are the ones that improve that. It's also probably one of the risk factors why women tend to have their heart attacks after they've gone through menopause, because the estrogen promotes HDL being higher. I mentioned early on about the metabolic syndrome, and what is that? Well, that's having 3 of the following criteria. It's like, I didn't quite have diabetes, or my blood pressure wasn't quite high enough to be treated, but what are the risk factors putting all these things together? So if on your lipid panel your triglycerides are over the ideal range, meaning you've got excess fat in your blood, not directly by itself a major heart disease risk factor. If your HDL good cholesterol is below 40 in men or 50 in women, if you're already on a blood pressure medicine, or if your blood pressure is, remember, in that stage 1 that we talked about, if you have an elevated blood sugar, but you're not quite a diabetic, ideal fasting blood sugar being below 100, diabetes 2 or more occasions above 126. So if you're in that pre-diabetes range, you know, that's a risk factor. And remember what I said about if you're in the overweight category, you should have your waist circumference, and this is why. If you've got metabolic syndrome because you've had at least 3 of these 5 criteria, it increases your risk of having a heart attack or stroke by 1.5 to 3 times. Weight loss improves all of the factors in the metabolic syndrome. When we talk about smoking, okay, what are we seeing? Well, 90% of smokers started before the age of 18. We see a prevalence in middle school and high school about 1.5% and 4.5% in 2020. But there's been a dramatic increase in e-cigarette smoke, and we don't necessarily have enough data to say how is that going to impact it. But because if it's got nicotine in it, you may not be at risk for cancer, but it's nicotine that causes vasospasm of our arteries and other things in smoke that cause clotting to occur more commonly. Adults have had, over the last several decades, a decreasing prevalence, so we've seen the percentage of adult smoking decrease, but it's slowed over the last several decades. It is considered probably the #1 preventable reason for heart attacks and stroke. And if you had your identical twin in that parallel universe and you're a smoker and you're got your 10-year cardiovascular risk factor, cigarette smoking is one of the questions. Are you a smoker? If you have one cigarette within the last 30 days, your risk is twice your identical twin who doesn't smoke. So again, the good news is when you quit smoking for a long enough period of time, and for heart disease, it can be within 1 year that your risk goes down to being the exact same as if you'd not smoked before. Cancers take longer for you to wash out. But what I do talk about is what are the years that you lose if you're a smoker. So if you're smoking at 35 years, you're going to live 8 years less than the individual who was your identical twin, every other risk factor being the same, but they're not a smoker. At 45, it's 6 years, and at 65, it's 4 years. But the good news is whenever you quit, you get about 75% of those years back, and you'll be healthier. So if you quit at 35, you're going to regain 6 of the 8 years that you would have lost. It's never too late to quit, so if you are a smoker or no smokers, never too late to quit because you get benefit at any point in your life. Setting a quit date is the #1 thing you have to do. In addition to treating the physiological addiction with something like any of the nicotine replacement therapies or the pill forms of medications you can use, you've got to also work on behavioral addiction or the habit of cigarette smoking, as well as other relaxation techniques. I used the patch to quit smoking. Great, did it work? Yes, but I'm up to 6 patches a day. So again, what's common is that when smokers try to quit, they've been buying their packs 1 day at a time, let's say. Over the course of the month, they're spending the exact same amount that they would on a patch or on the gum, but they have to pay for it all up front. And so they try to get off of their patch or their gum way before they're ready to feel comfortable being a non-smoker in the environment that they're used to doing. Okay. So this next song this was when I was in Ireland, actually. I've had the opportunity 3 times to go to Ireland. The first time I went was actually with a medical group. We were doing research and lecturing and talking with physicians from Europe as well as America, talking about certain cholesterol treatments. And then I was able to go. My mother-in-law and father-in-law took their entire family of kids, spouses, grandchildren, and we went to Ireland. And this was from then. But if you look there, this was back in 1999. So my risk factor for heart disease was a lot lower because of my age. But smoking causes fatal diseases. At that time in the United States, if you opened advertisements or had a smoking vending machine, what would you see? You'd see this gorgeous mountain, somebody riding the horse. So again, they were much more serious of trying to promote the negative aspects in Europe during that time period. So the next song is going to be Oh Danny Boy, and let me tell you a little bit about it before we start. It's kind of an interesting history. Again, probably the most well-known Irish ballad that's out there. Not exactly who wrote it. They're not exactly sure what the exact meaning. There were some thoughts that it was related to people, parents talking about their kids coming back from war or for the displaced people. But anyway, it touches the hearts of many individuals. And there was a New York policeman who once said that if they don't play Danny Boy at my funeral, I'm going to get up and walk out. So this is going to be Danny Boy with Mark leading in, and then we'll go from there. And please feel free to sing if you know the words. summer's gone and all the roses falling. It's you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. I'll be here in sunshine or in shadows. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so. But if ye come and all the flowers are dying, and I am dead, and dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say an Ave there for me. And I shall hear the soft tread above me, and all my grave will warmer, sweeter be. For you will bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until you come again. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about aspirin therapy. I mentioned that earlier. Let me just find my sheet here. Okay. So, aspirin therapy, again, if you go back years and years ago, we used to recommend almost to every male, especially over the age of 40, 45, that they should be on aspirin therapy unless there was a reason not to. Now, the reasons not to could be they've had a history of ulcers, they've had kidney disease, and those come into play. But it was very much an individualized thing, and you hear the Bayer commercials on TV, at least talk to your physician, which is good, because we no longer recommend it for most individuals. And that's because the amount of benefit that it has does not seem to prove that it's worth the potential risk. There is a calculator. It uses all of the data in that 10-year calculation for your heart disease risk, but then it asks some additional questions related to kidney disease, related to bleeding ulcers, or other types of antiplatelet therapy that you might be on. And it'll come up with a recommendation, so again can be standardized so that you wouldn't get a different recommendations as to no, there is no benefit, yes, there's definitely a benefit, and have a discussion and consider therapy. We'll talk a little bit about fitness now. 61% of Americans engage in some sort of leisure activity. Unfortunately, our kids in high school, only about 44% are getting the recommended 60 minutes 5 days a week that they should be getting, okay? Our goals, if you're following the American Heart Association guidelines, 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise most days of the week. We define that usually as 5 days a week. But in addition to the aerobic exercise, at least twice a week for 20 minutes, you should also be getting some resistance training, meaning doing weightlifting if you've got weights, or just use your own body weight, push-ups, squats, core exercises. If you're doing vigorous aerobic exercise as defined by your heart rate, then you actually can get by in the same benefit with less time and fewer days. So what is it? 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity, 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic exercise, and you need to do it in at least 10-minute increments. Okay, and that's why most weightlifting doesn't give you the aerobic exercise, because you're doing your exercise and then stopping doing your exercise, and your heart rate never maintains itself in a way. Additionally, women have an additional benefit if they do more time, so it will lower their heart disease risk even further. Different age groups, we use an equation to calculate it. The heart rate zones here include both the moderate intensity as well as the vigorous intensity in that 50 to 75. But I use a real quick calculation that if you take 170, subtract your age, you get a number. So if you were 50, that's going to be 120. Subtract 20 from that, that's 100. So moderate intensity is 100 to 120 approximately, and vigorous would be above that, and that's what you can use. As we get older, in that 60 and older, meeting the guidelines, what do we see? A decrease? Cardiovascular mortality, all-cause mortality, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and depression all improve if you're meeting American Heart Association guidelines. But you got to be careful. Something as simple as walking does count, as long as you get your heart rate up, as long as you're not going to the pastry store to get your sticky bun. So, I mentioned earlier that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. This is just a graphic representation of the 50 to 54-year-old, what their risk if you were a male or a female, and what changes. So as we have normal risk, what is it? As we start to add things like, oh, our cholesterol's a little higher, or now we're a diabetic in that third group of columns, or we're a diabetic, have high blood pressure, and we also have our smoking status. Let's talk just briefly about strokes, because all the interventions I've talked to are equally important and effective for stroke prevention, but the prevalence of stroke goes up. It tends to be much older when we start to see it more serious. The most common type is the ischemic stroke. That's with the blockages in the blood vessels in the brain, either from cholesterol, plaques building up, something breaking free and clogging an artery, and then you get dead cells beyond that. As you can see from this graph where you see stroke deaths, it kind of correlates where we also saw the people with obesity and diabetes, which would be other risk factors. As we talk about heart attacks and strokes as well, here's the symptoms for heart attack. Chest pressure, squeezing, somebody feeling like an elephant sitting on a chest, pain or numbness radiating up to the jaw or down the left arm, lightheadedness, dizziness, sudden shortness of breath, sudden cold sweats, nausea, lightheadedness, indigestion. Women are more likely to have the atypical symptoms, whereas men might be more likely to have the typical symptoms of that chest pain pressure. When we're looking at strokes, weakness or numbness, especially on one side of the body, difficulty with speech or understanding speech, confusion, headaches, trouble seeing with one or both eyes, depending on where in the brain you're getting affected, problems all of a sudden with balance or coordination. And we have the acronym FAST for stroke, facial drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, and both with stroke and heart attack. If you're not sure, if you know you're at risk, you go get checked, because time is tissue. The longer you wait before we can put a clot-busting agent either for your brain for a stroke or in your heart for a heart attack, the more damage it is and the more residual problems you'll have. So as the last song while we're doing the lection, then we're so start thinking about questions that you might have, and we'll turn the lights up at that particular time. But this is a song that's also, it's probably one of the oldest Irish hymns, called Be Thou My Vision. It was written somewhere between the 6th and the 10th century. Talks about the shield of God. We're not going to do all of the verses associated with it, but it talks about the strength of God protecting the Irish. It was finally translated into English from Gaelic in 1905. And so this is the song, Be Thou My Vision. Be thou my vision, O Lord. save that thou art, thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word, I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou my inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befalls, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Thank you. Hey, Jerry, why don't we turn, can the lights go up a little bit so I can see if there are any questions or anything, or will they just go all the way up? All the way up? That's all right. All right. So that's the presentation of the Preventing Your First Heart Attack and Stroke. I open it up now to questions if anybody has any. What I do ask is if you do ask a question, there's a chance I might not know the answer, and I'll be honest with you about that. But try to keep it generic, not about your specific health issues, because otherwise, you know, it takes too much to get into the specific of individuals. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. This is more of a comment. I'm a physical therapist.
Oh.
Day-to-day, what is moderate exercise? You can go by your breath. So if you can walking is like great. So walking, if you can sing, that's an easy exercise. No, that's strolling. If you are a little short on breath, so you're walking with your pal and you're a little out of breath, you can still talk, but you're just a little out of breath. That is moderate exercise. So if you have not been exercising, somewhere between a stroll and a little short on breath, that's moderate. If you cannot talk, stop and do a little less.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes? So the question would be, if everything of the things that are treatable with medicines are under control, is that good? And the answer is yes. The question would be, are there the other risk factors that if you're not reaching those goals? So the example be, there's not a pill I can give you to exercise, Okay? So if you're doing your cholesterol's managed, your diabetes managed, your blood pressure's managed, those are pretty much the ones that are really there related to, I can treat that if you come in and see me as a patient. But the other things that they're managing your weight, okay, yeah, we could do surgery if you're in the super obese category, okay, but managing your weight, the type of foods you eat can lower it. The physical activity you start to do lowers your heart disease risk on top of managing all of those other things that could be managed by your blood pressure, by medicines. Did I hear it, Mark?
Yes. How much do we lower our risk with Himalayan red salt or sea salt? Does that really work? Do they really work, or are we just eating a different kind of salt?
So I'm not familiar, so I'll be honest. I will say if it's sodium chloride, you're probably not doing too much. If it's potassium chloride, that's where we talk about in that DASH diet type thing where you're supplementing potassium rather than, but you have to be careful because certain people can't be on potassium as well, so you got to be careful from that standpoint. Yes? It's basically sodium chloride. Thank you, because I wasn't quite sure. So yeah, so if it's sodium chloride, you'd be stuck because the body is amazing in its desire to equalize things and change concentration, change pressures. So as you eat more salt, what ends up the body says, well, I need to dilute that. So it holds on to more water. If there's more water in your bloodstream, you've got to have a higher pressure to push it to the end of the line. Yes?
If you suspect somebody's having a heart attack, you still give them an aspirin?
Yeah, so if you are suspect, the preventive effect of just preventing that first heart attack is very different. But yes, so the question was, if you think somebody might be having a heart attack, should you go ahead and give them an aspirin? And the answer would be yes. Don't use a baby aspirin. If you might have to use 4 of them to equal a real full-strength aspirin. But we do that in the emergency room. So yes, I would definitely do that. You're not going to harm somebody, even if they got kidney disease. Well, if they got kidney disease and they're having a heart attack, do you really care about their kidneys at that point? I saw another, yes. We'll do the lady in the first, yes, right there. So the question was, if I got it right, so if you have high cholesterol, but don't have a family history, and you have a low calcium score, if you did one, I probably would never tell somebody to go get them, but they can get them on their own sometimes. Would you consider statin drugs? What I would actually do with my patient would be to sit them down, take all their risk factors, calculate their 10-year risk of having a heart attack. If their risk exceeded 7.5%, and let's just assume that was the only number that was their risk factor, I would talk to them about statins. If it was right on the borderline, if their blood pressure was a little high, we're not going to necessarily need to throw them on medicine that day. We could say, hey, your blood pressure's a little high. That's part of the calculation. Let's see what happens if we can lower it with diet and exercise over the next 3 months. And if that number comes down, it might change their number. But likewise, there could be an individual who's walking around with 189 on their LDL cholesterol, and it should be 100. Total cholesterol should be less than 200. And all of a sudden you might say, listen, when you're in that very high risk, 190 or higher, do I really want to wait for you to be blocking your arteries off when you're in your 30s? And that way you have your heart attack at 45 when the calculation might have clicked it. So it becomes individualized in certain situations. Right behind her, gentleman. Uh-huh. Well, I don't know enough about your history because there could be other reasons you should be on aspirin. But what we were doing 30 years ago and making the recommendation is very different. So if you were all of a sudden walking into that same cardiologist today, depending again on your risk factors, there might be a chance that they might not recommend aspirin or might recommend. But there can be other reasons to keep you on it. It all becomes a very specific discussion with the patient. I have taken patients off aspirin. I was on baby aspirin for years because I said, hey, I'd rather have the prevention than not. I didn't have a risk factor for it, but my doc took me off of it, and I said, you know, you're right, that's what the data is. I'm not special. Yes?
How do you talk to your patients about obesity and weight management? But people don't like those labels of
Yeah.
obese, and a lot of patients don't even want to be weighed when they come into medical centers.
Yeah.
There was an article in the Washington Post about cards that
Right.
don't weigh me.
Yeah, so that's, so the question was, how do you approach the patient who is medically obese, may be very sensitive, doesn't want to hear it, tried, whatever the case, how do you bring it up? And it is a very difficult, and sometimes you learn a little bit about how to do that, and if they don't want to have their weight, she was referencing a recent article, I saw that, where individuals who don't want to get weighed, have a little card and they give it to the nurse, say, I don't want to get weighed. Now, I'm more than willing to work with patients, and I don't mind if they don't want to get weighed every time. But if they're coming in for their wellness checkup, there's two choices. One is what the borderline person is. Then you have the person who everybody knows is obese. Does their weight matter? The weight is actually not in the calculation, okay? But you can still talk to them. And I usually talk because if I've got a weight, the computer prints out the BMI right for me. I see it. If they're here for their wellness, I will say, as we're going through your vital signs, your blood pressure was good, your BMI is at 30. Just to let you know, medically we use the definition of obesity for that because of its risk factors. And then we start talking about the exercise guidelines. I usually give them something to look at because I have something I can just click on a button. Here come the American Heart Association exercises. Here's the low cholesterol or the diabetic diet. I do talk about risk factors because if I don't talk to them about risk factors, I'm not doing my job of trying to prevent them from having a heart attack. I know I'm not going to be successful in getting them all to lose weight, and that's, you just have to address the tough issues sometime. Yes?
In your practice, so I know as a parent, you take your children until they're about 18 when the pediatrician says, okay, they go off to college. So there's this gap between, because we have children and they only go to the doctor if they get sick. They're not doing this annual physicals or these risk factors. So in your practice, are there tips on parents being able to say to this kind of age range where like you need to be paying attention to this for your future? Are there any hints, tricks? You can't be
So are you asking me as a doctor or as a parent? So it is very difficult. So let me talk a little bit because you used one of the words, and I talked about the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. And so we're trying to get value, and you used the word annual physical. And when I actually meet my patients now, I usually tell you that both words are wrong. You still use it when you're scheduling it. The insurance companies still say you're allowed to get an annual physical every year, okay? But in actuality, based on the data, annual, 20-year-olds don't need to be seen every year. I usually say twice in your 20s, 3 times in your 30s, 4 times, where we're just addressing your risk factor modifications. And what they found is if you're coming in with no physical complaints, which is a different type of an evaluation, that doing a head-to-toe exam is completely useless. We don't find anything. Okay, and so in general, and so it's changed its term to a periodic wellness assessment is the terminology that should be used, but it's too hard to reteach everybody that, and it's different for every age group. as how frequent, what you do and include with it, but getting those younger adults to do it. Some will come in because they just got their first insurance. You know, parents might say, oh, my mom wanted me here, I'm 20 years old, I'm a senior in, college or whatever. Okay, so what do you want to address? Oh, I don't know, And so we'll just go through this and we'll look at identifying their risk factors so they know them. Do they need to do the same thing at 20 that they may need to do at 40? Well, on diet and exercise, yes, but not on necessary cholesterol management, even if their number stays the exact same for the next 60 years.
Well, I think the main topic, thank you, was the fact that if you have that family history. So when I
Right.
go to the doctor, I put, the family history of what I can remember about my mother, my grandmother,
Right.
that. But there's the generation, like I wasn't really paying attention to that until,
Till you thought it mattered.
right.
Yeah. So that's pretty common. Any other questions? Yes. So did I hear you say if the patient has AFib? Okay, so atrial fibrillation is a condition where the upper chamber of the heart just can beat. It's always irregular. Our upper chamber is our heart, whereas our pacemaker is lub-dub, lub-dub, your regular heartbeat. But in atrial fibrillation, the muscle is just vibrating, not squeezing. And so that puts you at risk for developing clots, which can then break free and go up to your brain, give you a stroke, go into your heart arteries, and give you a heart attack. So the question then was about exercise. What do you do about those individuals? Because they may be more likely to be on certain medicines that are going to control their heart rate. And as you exercise, your heart rate's supposed to go up. Well, it may not be able to go up, so you're going to get more fatigued, easier, have some more shortness of breath. And in that situation, we just say, do what you can do and do it on a regular basis. If you start having severe shortness of breath, that might be a reason to go get seen by your cardiologist. Yes, one last question.
Is there any reason to have a stress test if you have no symptoms of any cardiac problems, just to check it out?
So the answer is, should you do any test, but her question was any test like a stress test when you don't have risk factors, and my answer is no. And that's because the way we determine normals on a lot of things, there are individuals who will have normals with nothing wrong with their heart, let's say. And if you do the test in somebody with a low chance of having it before you even did the test, if it's positive, it's probably wrong, but it then leads you down the track of actually doing another test like a catheterization, which could say, yeah, her cath was perfectly clean, but she died on the table as a side effect of the procedure. So you want to make sure. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, again, there's a lot of docs who have a slab of tests they order every year because their patients like it or whatever, but very few tests are actually recommended as far as routine screening. Same test might be done if you're symptomatic. So I wanted to thank everybody. One of the groups that helped get the message out were our Knights of Columbus. They're in the back. They've got a booth if they're still here. We got a thumbs up. If anybody's from the parish is interested in the Knights of Columbus, if anybody wants to donate to one of their causes, we'd be happy to have you do that. It's not mandatory, obviously. But this last song that I'm going to do, and then Mark will, as people are breaking up, play something as well. It's another song, May the Road Rise Up. Okay, so again, this rising up. Tim Gleason was a friend of ours who went to Ireland the last time. I mentioned the 2 times I went to Ireland. The 3rd time I went to Ireland, I have a group of buddies that we golf with, and we usually golf on the weekend of the Masters here in the United States, because we all did our master's degree together. And we would go and golf in the morning and watch the Masters in the evening, and then go and consume heart-healthy dinners, and of course. And we would do that, and then all of a sudden, my wife and I were thinking about going back to Ireland, and one of them came up with the idea in 2019, the British Open, the Open as it's officially called, was being played in Ireland for the first time in 50 years. And they said, why don't we go play golf in Ireland and then go watch the Open? And I said, sure. Now these guys, if we send an email back and forth, normally take about 2 or 3 days for all 3 other people to respond to the email. And I said, well, I've already talked to my wife about it. I think we should invite our wives if we're going overseas. And within 20 minutes, I got a unanimous no, they're not interested. But I had already invited my wife, and so I went to Ireland to golf and go to the Open for a week, and then my wife, Tim Gleason, and his wife came over, and they came over for the second week, so I had a great time. All right, we're ready for this last song, all right, Jerry? So let me see if I can get this. This is actually the Cliffs of Moher, which are part of the May the Road Rise Up. And there'll be some words if you want to sing along with the chorus. A little louder. Like the waves of the ocean crashing on the cliffs of Moher, the western winds are blowing all along the Galway shore. From the high walls of Derry to the rolling hills of Kerry, all across this Irish homeland, there's a welcome at the door. May the road rise to meet you, a smile always greet you. May our friendship be always true and strong. And as the sun sets in the west, I wish you all the best. Please God, we'll meet again before too long. Oh, the troubles of our world, we'll leave them at the door. We'll raise a glass to friends who passed, remembering them once more. May the luck of the Irish be with you every day. Who knows what tomorrow brings? Let's live for today. May the road rise to meet you, a smile always greet you. May our friendship be always true and strong. And as the sun sets in the west, I wish you all the best. Please God, we'll meet again before too long. All right, you're going to see words here in a minute. Just for the refrain. May the road rise to meet you, smile always greet you. May our friendship be always true and strong. And as the sun sets in the west, I wish you all the best. Please God, we'll meet again before too long. All right, louder. May the road rise to meet you, and smile always greet you. May our friendship be always true and strong. And as the sun sets in the west, I wish you all the best. Please God, we'll meet again. Please God, we'll meet again. Please God, we'll meet again before too long. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, Mark.